The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not represent the views of any Grand Lodge nor a pendant body of Freemasonry.
Welcome back, brethren, to the Masonic Shelf podcast, where we crack open the pages of Masonic literature and esoteric writings. I am one of your hosts, Brad Kohanke.
And I am Chris Williams.
So tonight we have our first guest reviewer. This has been in the works for a little over a month. We have Right Worshipful T. Lucas Minton, who is the Grand Senior Warden for the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of Arkansas. The book that we're going to be reviewing tonight was a book of his choosing, and it's entitled The Lost Rites and Rituals of Freemasonry by David Harrison. So sit back, relax, and let's get into it. Well, welcome, Lucas. Tell us a little bit about your Masonic history and what brings you to where you're at today.
Sure. I was raised here in Arkansas, and I'm a fourth generation Mason. But very early on, I became very interested in all the whys of the ritual, not just the words, and very interested in the history, all the symbols, obviously, like all of us. Psychology, and that curiosity kind of led me to explore a couple different books, and both mainstream and obscure books, and that's actually how I came across Harrison. So, as you guys know, I'm the Grand Senior Warden here in Arkansas, and that gives me a unique, not just perspective, but a unique kind of situation I'm in, where I can kind of help push brethren toward ritual education, and help them kind of encourage folks to some ritual study, but as well as the historical aspects of the ritual and where our rites all have come from in the past.
Yeah, when we invited you on, we asked you what book you'd want to choose, and the only thing you told me was, I don't know, but it's going to be by David Harrison.
That's true. That's a true statement. That's it's been a lot of eye-opening work for me, trying to go through some of his work and kind of put everything together. And I'll tell you, the way that I learned who he was and what he had contributed to Freemasonry on all things was through Twitter, or X. It was Twitter at the time. And he was on there. I was like, oh, that guy's pretty neat. And then he was talking about his books. I was like, oh, those books look pretty neat. He said, I'll sign them and send them. And I said, I'm in the States. He said, I'll send to the States. It's weird. The mail works that way too. And so here we are. I mean, at that point, I was I think I was the grand junior deacon, about to be senior deacon. I think that's right. But anyway, it might have been when I got the next book. I can't remember. But anyway, but I devoured this one, and I was just absolutely fascinated with all the historical aspect of it, and then all of his research into the mystical rites and all of that stuff, all the kind of surrounding stuff that we hit on with the Rose Croix stuff. A lot of that actually
there was quite a few references to that in this particular book, so that's pretty cool.
Yes, and that's what actually kind of got me on that kick. And Harrison's really great because he points out that in a time not too long ago, we had Grand Lodges and we had subordinate lodges, but it was very messy. And this is what it looked like. And it just fascinates me.
Well, you've always been a big history buff, so it didn't surprise me that you chose one of his books to focus on for this review. So,
beginning to end, I thought it was a great read. Anyone that's is interested in the history of Freemasonry, I think it's great because it talks about the competing Grand Lodges. Of course, you start out with your premier Grand Lodge. It breaks into the ancients and the moderns, and there's the the question of the Irish, all this kind of stuff. But then you also keep reading, you find out a little bit about the Grand Lodge at York, which some say function more like a local lodge, but they actually put out charters. So that was fascinating to me as well, because, like I said, it was a messy time. But I got a quote here that I thought was really great at the beginning of chapter 2, and it was this. It says, "Masonry has among its brethren Enoch and Elias," and that was from Cagliostro's first degree of the Egyptian Rite.
Yeah, Cagliostro, he's the one that was known as the Masonic magician. I think they're
Correct.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that was, I think, part of the this guy over here. Get a load of this guy. He thinks he's a magician. He thinks he's this. He thinks that he's a charlatan. And so, like I said, I thought that was super super interesting. All the information on him.
But these were the guys that had to go to France.
Right.
Because they were pretty much exiled from their own country, right?
Right. So
and that's where this influence on Masonry on the continent, the
right.
European continent, kind of happened.
Well, that's if you're a Scottish Rite member in the 8th degree, they actually call it content. They actually mention, I shouldn't say call it, but they mention continental Masonry, and that continental Masonry is what that it's a little more alchemical than what we would call, a little more, some people would even say, intense than what we're used to in the York tradition. And so that's that influence came to Scotland, that Jacobite piece of the puzzle there, because you had a lot of those Scottish. There were strong ties between Scotland and France because they both hated England, and so that filtered into the Masonry. And he kind of hits on that French influence as he's talking about the Jacobites. And it was my understanding in reading the book that it was kind of a common phrase. They might call it high grade Masonry or high Masonry, but it was also hot grade or out grade. My French is obviously not very good. You can ask the folks that I went with last year, including my wife. They'd say he can't get that crazy R correct. But that hot grade Masonry, that high grade, really kind of coming over from the continent with all the Templarism and that French and German influence.
So
one of the things that kind of jumped out at me when I started reading the book, and I thought the book was very good. One of the things that kind of jumped out was how all of these rites rose to prominence and were so popular and everything, and then boom, they all, most of them just died out as quick as they started, and without a lot of them, due to I think it was the fashion of the time, and it was fashionable to have all this drama, and even allow some of them allowed women to be in the rites, but they couldn't provide. It seemed like most all of them could not provide a strong connection to anything ancient. And in other words, they claimed they had ancient roots here and ancient roots there, but they could never substantiate. They could never prove it, and that was the demise of a lot of them, just for that reason.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the first one I want to talk about is the Rite of Strict Observance with Baron von Hund.
Yep.
And that ties into the Jacobite influence, because some Masonic writers, such as A.E. Waite, have made reference of the supposed Jacobite origins of von Hund's rites. In Paris, von Hund believed he came into contact with a certain Knight of the Red Feather, whose identity was never revealed, but von Hund believed was none other than the young pretender Charles Edward Stuart. So there's the Jacobite tie-in with the Rite of Strict Observance on the continent. And that's one of the first rites that he starts talking about in this book. So, what do we know about the rite of strict observance, Lucas?
So the rite of strict observance, I got to reopen on that one. The of all the things, so he had these unknown, what do you call them, unknown superiors,
Right.
and he talked about the unknown superiors, and that's who he received his work from, was the Knight of the Red Feather. Did I say that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that was an interesting piece, because he talked about it, and then he started initiating people into it. And it's more toward the end of the book, but it talked about, and then they find, they come back later. They're like, well, we don't know who it was, so it doesn't matter. And so it's just kind of like they I guess you could say, almost like they threw it away, for lack of a better way to, let me see if I can pull this up right here.
It says it had 7 degrees,
Yes.
and it became pretty popular. It was in Switzerland, Holland, Denmark, Russia,
Oh, it was
France, Germany.
prolific, I think you could say.
Yeah.
Whoops. Yeah, and so they had the 3 craft degrees. I was actually on this earlier. They had 3 craft degrees. And what was interesting, I thought, was nobody was admitted a Scots master other than a child of the order. The Rite celebrating Scotland and its secret Templar heritage seems to echo the chivalric ideas presented in the oration of Chevalier Ramsay. So he was also mirrored in his suggestion of mysterious Jacobite source for the system. Now, another thing that's really interesting that this made me think of, the legend, the myth, the rumor, whatever you want to call it, of the 29, some places say 29, someone wants to just say some Templar that came to help Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn. So that kind of was an echo to me of kind of the origins, if you will. And so another thing was the law in the chapter 6 with the lost archaic symbols. He hits on the Melusino rite and the Bavarian Illuminati symbol of the Owl of Minerva. Can be considered lost and belong to a particular order that ceased to meet after 1784, as could the symbol of the lion, which was used as the emblem of the Scots degree in the rite of strict observance. So to Masons, that should be something interesting in and of itself. For those that are theologians, you've obviously got that callback to Judah. And the Christians, you got the Lion of Judah, those who are interested in astrological things. But anyway, that was a symbol. That was an archaic symbol for the rite of strict observance that was lost over time.
And even though the rite of strict observance disappeared, it was among the first higher grade degree systems that was introduced, and as a result impacted the formation of the rectified Scottish Rite,
regular lodges too,
and the Rite of Philalethes, and all of the subsequent higher grade masonries. So this is the beginning of the evolution of what would eventually become our current version of a lot of these degrees.
And that's actually one of the big takeaways. I think anyone that I've kind of proselytized about this book, I said, if you want to know where your modern Scottish Rite and York Rite degree systems come from, this will show you the evolution of the degree systems. Now, it doesn't say this went here and this went here, but you can see it coalescing. And if we specifically look at rite of strict observance, it has your 3 craft degrees and then has the 4 high grades. And what's interesting about that is, in a system not too different than the Scottish Rite system, you have 3 grades that are or 3 degrees that are your Blue Lodge grades that we don't really see practice. Now we will. There are those degrees that were inside of that there's no reason for us to assume they were that much different than what we would have seen practice at a regular blue or symbolic lodge, I should say.
So one of the next ones he talks about is the rite of Elu Cohen's, which was Pasquale's group.
Yeah, this is and so we'll get to it in a minute. The Swedenborg rite is also fascinating, but so Pasquale what's really interesting is you see the names that come up a few times. Pasquale, and he's a big one because you had springing up from him. You have these different traditions of the Elus Cohens, and you also have this over here that is the what becomes the Martinism, the way of the heart, all this kind of stuff, and all this kind of comes. It's all, you've got this kind of original source that kind of broke down. And I was once told, and I don't know, probably one of y'all actually said this if I give you credit. In these more mystical traditions, what matters most is who trained you, kind of like who's your daddy and what did he do, kind of like that. And Elus Cohen's was a much more mystical tradition that eventually died out. A lot of these did die out. Now there's a modern group, and Harrison actually mentions there's a modern group, but said there's no definitive tie going back to the original Pasquale group.
Yeah, a lot of these groups that were formed in the 1700s kind of went through a resurrection or a resurgence in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and some of those little groups are still around, but there's no dotted line connecting those. A lot, and we'll get into this later, but a lot of those resurrected rites that claim to be descendants of the originals were guys that claim to have contacted the dead originators through seances and stuff like that. That's pretty interesting. But you're right, Pasquale, and David says in this, he says Pasquale merged esoteric doctrines based on Gnosticism and the Kabbalah. In short, his version of Freemasonry blended with magic to form a unique type of rite. In this sense, the teachings of the Rite de Elu Cohens enabled selected members to learn an aspect of magic that aimed to place the adept in communion with supernatural beings. Pasquale was particularly influential on Willermos and San Martin, both taking his teachings in different directions. So Pasquale and von Hund were really, really influential on the rest of these things that we're going to see develop over the next century.
John Yarker, his Arcane Schools book, it's a tour de force of where all this stuff kind of came from, kind of what they believe, especially because even when he was writing, a lot of this stuff was already gone. And I feel like he doesn't get his due because he might have had some bad information here and some bad information there, but he did a lot. And he actually put in here, talking about Pasquale, he'd said that, and this is one thing that, we talk about some of this stuff being dubious. It says he mentions a curious charter or patent this is being Yarker, that was issued by none other than Charles Stewart on the 20th of May, 1738, which gave the father of Martinez Pasquale permission to create lodges for the Rite de Elu Cohens. And he mentions Stewart, the Bonnie Prince Charlie of history, describing the document in the document as King of Scotland, Ireland, and England, and Grand Master of all lodges on the face of the earth.
Yeah, Yarker probably got some. He was involved in one way, shape, or form in many of these rites, and he got painted with a kind of a broad stroke, and ended up taking some of the heat for some of the not so good things about some of them. But he was, as far as I can tell, he was one of the straight up guys. I mean, he was doing it for the right reason, and I don't think he got painted with the same brush as Cagliostro and a couple of the others too.
If you find a copy of the original Arcane Schools book, most people don't realize that they're like, oh, that's very controversial. Look on the spine, because it has the Indus Valley version of the swastika. And so you end up with those books get put up where people don't, kind of lose their mind. But he was a great credit to Freemasonry, and like I said, Harrison talks about him quite a bit, and all the work he did. He's not a primary source, but he's a solid secondary source, I think, in a lot of cases. But now the other thing we got to talk about is the Swedenborgian Rite.
Yeah, because Swedenborg wasn't even a Mason.
That's what I was going to say. So the guy isn't a Mason, not affiliated. And then they come back, what was it, like 50, 100 years later, they're like, no, he really was. It's like, what? and Harrison says it, he's like, oh, they come back and they say he was. Well, this is kind of like, it's kind of a black and white question. There's nothing that leads us to believe that. But what's fascinating, he wasn't a Mason. And then there's a Rite that's based off of his teachings. And he's considered one of the most, what was it he said, one of the most prolific mystical writers of Western esotericism. Yeah. Something like 30 volumes.
Well, and there's a Swedenborgian church that's been around for several hundred years that was established after the Rite went away, that's still in existence. As a matter of fact, I follow them on Facebook. They have a large Facebook group and a pretty large following. And it is a fascinating group of guys to watch.
And in the first line, he actually says, Swedenborg has never been proven to be a Freemason. He was, however, a mystic theologian, philosopher, scientist, inventor. His teaching work ultimately inspired the Swedenborg Rite. He was, I was reading this. His father was this professor of theology, but Emanuel Swedenborg was what we, for the most part, I would say he was what we would call a modern day engineer. And because he was into flying machines, anatomy, undertaking different studies and different aspects of learning. And it was later in life that he had this kind of spiritual awakening. He transitioned to become from just a man of science to a mystic who could talk to angels, spirits, demons, claimed to have received a new revelation from Jesus Christ and the Last Judgment, and then ended up in London where he died in 1772.
Yeah, he lived to be 84 years old.
Yeah, in a time that people did not live that long.
Yeah.
Swedenborg talked to spirits. Pasquale talked to spirits. But, one thing that he doesn't really hit in this book, which I think would have been right at home, and I don't know if you could prove anything, but I just happen to think that there had to have been a lot. I mean, you're 200 years removed, I get it, but there had to have been a lot of influence from old John Dee. I wonder about that.
Yeah, yeah. He's like briefly mentioned in the book as an advisor to Elizabeth the First.
Yeah, so I go back to, like I said, Harrison doesn't really explicitly mention it in here, but I do go back to wondering how many of these guys were influenced by that. Because it was written. Well, I think a lot of D stuff appeared actually after his death, but it's just super, super interesting to me. How many of these rites that are no longer around? That was kind of a thing, is we want to talk to these heavenly beings.
Yeah.
And whether you actually talk to them or not is not necessarily important to a lot of people.
That's true.
They'll go along with whatever you say, and some of these guys, Cagliostro included, were pretty influential people when talking to groups. The story of Cagliostro being called into the French court and charged with all kinds of crimes, and he offered to debate their best Masonic representative, and apparently that representative couldn't hold his couldn't hold the conversation with Cagliostro, and they ended up letting him go. But everything, sooner or later, everything came around full circle and got him. But he was a pretty influential guy, pretty colorful, dramatic guy.
Let's go on to chapter 2. Oh, this is the part where they talk about John Dee and Edward Kelly and the communion with angels.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Chapter 2. Okay.
So Dee, in some respects, could be considered an early scientist, and he was a mathematician. Yet his search for lost knowledge knew no boundaries, and magic became another pathway for him to thoroughly explore astrology, alchemy, divination, scrying, and summoning were all ways in which Dee sought answers, and he became the advisor to Elizabeth I, advising her in astrology and on matters of science. How did he and Kelly get together, and what's Kelly's involvement in all of this?
And he essentially like kind of put out feelers. He's like, can anyone, do, scrying, whatever you call it. Can anyone do this? Can anyone da 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 da? And that's how him and Kelly came together. And the question has always been, is any of this real, or was Edward Kelly taking John Dee for a ride? But that's always been, at least in what I've read, that's always been a question, was Dee taken for a ride by Kelly or not? But, they put out this whole system, and Cagliostro came after this, and it might be arguable, like I said, he was influenced by this, but they put out this system of the Enochian alphabet, Enochian magic. They put out the magic squares, the prophecy. Him and Kelly put out all this stuff. Whether or not Kelly took it for right or not, I mean, the volumes that they put out were impressive. And I feel like
there's no doubt that Dee believed it.
Oh, there's no doubt Dee believed that it was real.
Yeah.
And I read something. I don't think it was. I don't think it was in this book. Maybe it was in this book at the end, but I don't think so. Harrison, I don't think mentions it, but in passing. But Dee, as Elizabeth's astrologer, like he would be asked to come up with preferable days on her calendar for certain events, and I'm trying to remember what they. I think they call that the mundane astrology or something like that. But he was asked to do matters of state. What would matter for matters of state to do on certain days, and like I said, he was asked to do it. Kelly was the one who was working on so much of this, so it makes you wonder. But like you said, Dee believed it. I mean, there's no doubt he did.
Well, he may have believed it, but the fact that Kelly was a convicted fraudster and all of that didn't help Dee a whole lot in convincing people that everything was on the up and up.
Hey, Chris, forget about that. Look over here.
Exactly. That's exactly. That was then. This is now.
There you go.
Well, regardless of whether or not Kelly was a fraudster, Dee believed it, and they must have been effective together in advising Elizabeth, because England did pretty well back then, and he was her advisor for quite a long period of time.
It was a long time. I don't remember how many years. I mean, it was. I want to say it's like 2 decades or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and you think everything's kind of going good, and it sounds all on the up and up until you read that Dee and Kelly's partnership ended a few years after a wife swapping incident in 1587. That kind of ruins the whole the whole thing there.
I've got a joke or two about that.
But it was ordered by the angels, Chris. Don't you understand?
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Ordered by the angels.
That was it.
Yeah, I see where it's it. Dee returned to England 2 years later, leaving Kelly on the continent, where he became an alchemist in the employ of Rudolph II, who ultimately wound up imprisoning him, probably in an attempt to stop him escaping until he had produced gold.
pretty soon you tell everybody you can do all this stuff. You gotta do it.
Put up or shut up, right?
Shut up.
So Willermos learned from Pasquale, correct?
Right.
And so he was the one that started drawing the circles on the floor and using the incantations.
Hmm.
Um, After lighting all the tapers, the name of God was supplicated and the names of the angels were recited. However, in spite of his dedication, Willermos only reported seeing visions of colors, sparks, and the feeling of goosebumps, ultimately becoming dissatisfied with the results. His close friend and colleague, Louise Claude de Saint Martin, who also became known as the unknown philosopher, believed there could be a direct communion between man and God and that we are all Christ's. So there you've got Pasquale to Willermos to St. Martin.
Hmm. And what's interesting is so much of this stuff, like we said, kind of died off and then got brought back. And, Harrison hits on this, that we can actually kind of thank that occult revival. I think it might be another chapter or so in, but anyway, we can kind of thank the occult revival that kind of started in the mid 19th century for really pulling this stuff back from the brink. Saint Martin, being unknown philosopher, and the way of the heart coming out, which is probably the best known of these more mystical traditions that are still kind of floating around out there. Just really, like I said, this more mystical traditions that Harrison's hitting on. You really come back with this idea of who trained you, this guy? Is there a legitimate succession? And they hit on I'm going to try and say this, probably butcher it. Gerard and Casse, who used the pseudonym Papus or Papus, and claimed to have several of his original San Martin's original notebooks, including or something that he hoped would give some legitimacy to the revival, and copy part of the Cagliostro Rite as well, and from a transcription taken from an original copy. So you've got Papus or Papus, however you say it. I've heard it said both ways. But you've got him that's also thought of fairly well in these more mystical and esoteric circles, that he is pointing back, San Martin, which is pointing back at Pasquale. Mm-hmm. And so you're seeing this, you're seeing these dotted lines, like you said.
Yeah, and that's one of the cool parts of this book, because we've heard all these names before, and we've got like individual books about Cagliostro or Saint Martin or Pasquale, but this is the first time that I've actually read a description of how they were all kind of interrelated, and how they learned from each other, and the ascendancy of these teachings and rites, and how they were changed over time and by who. But they all had influence on each other, and it just kind of grew. Cagliostro's Egyptian rite has survived in written form, yet elements of the ritual remain a mystery. Cagliostro's seances, for example, may be interpreted as purely symbolic in nature and may have been part of the theater of ritual. With Cagliostro's rather mysterious background and tainted image, his claims may be seen as part of the general mania at the time for the blend of spiritualism and masonry that attracted the social elite, thus bringing Cagliostro closer to orbit of the rich and powerful.
Now, I'm gonna read something off here, because this has got a contemporary piece I think is interesting. Cagliostro's particular form of Freemasonry has continued to attract speculation associated with the more libertine lifestyles of the 18th century France. And here's where we get contemporary. Another more recent theory has been put forward that, aside from being symbolic, a type of acacia was actually used in particular rituals to produce a psychedelic effect. Masonic researcher P.D. Newman has suggested that acacia was used in Cagliostro's Egyptian rite for this purpose, and in a transcription of the ritual, acacia is identified as the primal matter that was created by God.
I saw that too, and I thought it was so cool that they referenced Danny.
I thought that was
Minnesota.
really great. I thought that was a really good shout out for Newman because this is across the pond, and
Yeah.
this is Masons recognizing other Masons' work.
Yeah. And Danny's work on this, I've got his books, and he came and spoke at one of our meetings one time, and he has a very compelling argument for a particular branch of acacia that has some psychedelic effects and its use in the Cagliostro Egyptian rite.
Well, I mean, and then later in that paragraph, it says, enjoyed by Moses, Enoch, Elias, David, Solomon, and the king of Tyre, and other great ones, suggesting that acacia was an essential ritualistic ingredient.
Yeah.
But I think this is the first time in the book. Yeah, I don't think it's the only time. I think it's the first time that actually they talk about, or I should say, Harrison actually talks about something to put someone in an altered state. I think he mentions it toward the end again. But I thought that was really interesting because that is not something that I would have ever came to on my own. But being that you could argue that Danny's books are more speculative and this is more historical, I thought that was that gives a lot of tells you it carries a lot of water, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm going to read this one part because it describes how it may have been used. It says, as the ritual gets underway, the candidate is urged to drink the red liqueur to raise his spirits so he or she could understand the following address by the worshipful master. My child, you are receiving the primal matter. Understand the blindness and the dejection of your first condition. Then you did not know yourself. Everything was darkness within you and without. Now that you have taken a few steps in the knowledge of yourself, learn that the great God created before man this primal matter and that he then created man to possess it and be immortal. Man abused it and lost it, but it still exists in the hands of the elect of God, and from a single grain of this precious matter becomes a projection into infinity. That sounds like something you would hear in an ancient mystery school.
Yes, it does.
When they were drinking the beer that had been infected with that fungus that caused visions and stuff. I can't remember the name of it.
Now, Chris, I'm gonna ask you if you noticed what kind of place a lot of this happens in.
You're talking about the chamber of reflection?
Yeah, man.
Yeah. That is, gosh, we can talk about that till we all go crazy, and it's still the same. It's still something that's necessary. I don't know why we cannot get across that barrier as to why it's helpful rather than hurtful. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Just doesn't make any sense. And I don't know about you, but I remember my degrees, and I know that I would have been a lot more receptive and a lot more into what was going on as it was going on had I had that experience.
And might have been using other 18th century rituals, namely the Melissino Rite,
Right.
Which explored masonry, alchemy, and altered state of perception. And it said to inhale, use fumes for his candidates to inhale from burning coal of the matter instead of digesting it through drink. He hits on, Cagliostro, and I don't think he said anything about Melissino being like this, but he mentioned it was also a more libertine lifestyle as well. But I thought that was super interesting.
Cagliostro sounds like he may have been the Aleister Crowley of his time.
I would say that's probably an accurate depiction. Was that Chris?
That I say without a doubt, because not only were they into the altered states and the magic, well, he I think was one of the first ones that introduced the sexual element into it.
Said there have been certain English Freemasons who have enjoyed a life of debauchery that included overindulgence of alcohol, laudanum and opiates, such as Bramwell Bronte, I guess that's how you say that, who's a member of the Lodge of Three Graces in Haworth, Yorkshire. And certainly Freemasons, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde wrote about the use of opium in late Victorian society.
And it says at the end of that sentence, even Crowley had his drug addictions. Talk about an understatement. It says, however, there is no evidence whatsoever that these gentlemen combined their Masonic interests with any form of drug use, but their awareness of opiates reminds us how commonplace the use was amongst the gentleman classes during the Victorian era. I don't know, that's up for discussion, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there's no proof doesn't mean that it didn't exist.
That's true.
So the end of that chapter is all about the evolution of the Rose-Croix decree, which you talked about in your short, but you want to just give us a brief overview of that? Because I find it fascinating that particular degree, whether it's called Rose-Croix or Ne Plus Ultra or whatever, shows up everywhere.
All the time.
Yeah.
Well, first on, just because I feel like we messed up, we didn't mention. We also got to talk about, or I should say, talk about. We got to throw out there that there was that other Egyptian group, Memphis Mizraim. There was that one.
Yeah.
But so we got to throw them a bone. But back on what you were saying. So what I thought was interesting when you're making it toward the end of the chapter, you fly through alchemy and the rite of the Black Eagle, and anyone who's familiar with the Scottish Rite knows that your 30th degree is you're a knight of the Black and White Eagle. And like I mentioned in the short, when you're talking about the Rose-Croix, you have the life, death, rebirth. You have the putrefaction, sublimation, and resurrection, or purification, whatever. I can't remember my last word. My mind just went blank. But you've got those three pieces. You got the Black Eagle, and then you come to this, toward the end of the chapter, and then they start talking about the Rose-Croix, which has these elements in it. And so the Rose-Croix keeps popping up. And I mentioned in the short too, the Baldwin Rite, all this stuff, but they all had this Rose-Croix piece. And I think that the fact it was so prolific that Rosicrucianism might not have been so overt, but it was like a glimmer of it here and there. It does lend some credibility toward Masonry having some type of Rosicrucian ancestor, if you will. Maybe it was supposed to be the outer court in the beginning. If these people are interested in this, maybe they'll be interested in that. I mean, no one can say, but it definitely has the markings, the Rose-Croix degree, the plus ultra, whatever else, has all the markings of that classic alchemy Rosicrucianism.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt of the interrelatedness of the two.
And with 99 degrees, I think if you actually went through all 99 degrees, you'd find a whole lot more.
Are you talking about Memphis and Mizraim?
Yeah.
Yeah, that 99 degrees. Holy crap.
Well, but you also got to wonder, though, because he kind of hits on it briefly, but you got to wonder if it was part of that was like when Pike came to the Scottish Rite and you had a concept, but you didn't have a degree. It makes you wonder if that was part of it. Or I want to say in the Franken manuscript, like the 30th through the 32nd degree, until Pike came in there and put it, really hashed it out. 30 through 32nd was all like one degree. It was three pieces, but all one degree. Yeah. And it was all, the trying to put the pieces together. And then Pike kind of broke it down. This is your Nakadosh. This is the initiate to the Egyptian mysteries, or Inspector Inquisitor, and this is the royal, Prince, Sublime Prince, the Royal Secret, later Master of the Royal Secret. So it makes me wonder if 99 degrees, that if you had, these 5 degrees are this one concept, these 7 degrees are this concept.
Makes me wonder how we break them into different apartments now.
Right.
Numbered differently back then. Yeah.
It makes me wonder. because that would be tedious.
Yeah.
You're not going to do one of those in a festival day, I promise you.
Nope.
So the next chapter is when we get into this, what he calls the occult revival. And
Yes, that's right.
after all of these rites have kind of disappeared and their originators have passed away, and then you've got like 100 years later, these guys that are rekindling interest in some of these lost rites, like Yarker and A.E. Waite, and a guy that I had not heard of before, William Killiam.
Yeah, I don't think you'll hear that name anywhere else. I've never heard of that guy.
Well, and he apparently he changed his name when he became a Muslim.
Muslim, yes.
Yeah, William Abdullah.
And I thought it was interesting. It said Victorian polymath. But yeah, that's a name you don't.
Quilliam was also
hear
the
about.
most worshipful Grand Master of the ancient order of Zuzamites. What?
I don't know, but I'm sure that is now a side degree somewhere with a name like that. I mean, what do you call those guys? Zeusies? I mean, I don't know. And it says a somewhat exotic order. It says ritual 1918 years before the Christian era and refers to the Egyptian god Osiris searching for Isis and the lost gem of truth.
So this is the chapter where we start learning of Golden Dawn and SRIA,
Waite, Pamela
Westcott, Yarker, Mathers.
Now, I thought on a personal level, I thought it was great having that piece about Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. I thought that was interesting being in here because now that is something that still is around, that was brought back or was a product of, I should say, the occult revival, and it brought back some of those traditions, alchemical and so forth, mystical Christianity. It brought forth those traditions kind of into what you would call at the time the modern age. But SRIA also gave rise to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn because it wasn't mystical enough for Mathers specifically.
Both of these are overtly Masonic. I mean, they aren't separate any longer. This is a Rosicrucian group that is purely associated with Freemasonry.
100%.
For the first time, outwardly, you know.
And what was also interesting is how it was in England, obviously, it was that springboard, and you had Golden Dawn come from there, but you also had that next group that you had Frederick Hockley and Francis George Irwin come out of, and they were communing with spiritual beings with their famous seances. And he does mention Dean Kelly on the other page. Says similar to the descriptions that were given of Pasquale's teaching and have a similarity to Dean Kelly's work as well. Their seances. And although this isn't so much of a group, I thought it was really great that Harrison put it in the book, because you're getting little pieces and parts of, how do we end up with these different groups? Because you got, SRIA over here, you got SRICF, you got AMORC now, you've got all these little pieces and parts. And then you've also got some of the stuff that's just kind of randomly floating around of these small associations.
Just like the original groups died out when their charismatic founders died out, a lot of these rites and organizations that were born again during the occult revival died out when their charismatic founders either had a falling out or imprisoned or died and didn't survive the test of time. I mean, there's a current incarnation of the Golden Dawn, but that was way after the demise of the original. But SRIA is still around and going strong from what I've been able to.
So there seems to be a common theme between a lot of these things that came back and died out again. And there's a sentence in the chapter that says, that this Mackenzie being a cultist who felt that the craft masonry held little appeal. So they got to the end of craft masonry and decided that it didn't, there wasn't anything there for them. And so they left Freemasonry and to explore the high grades. And I think they took with them, people that were of the same mind, or thought they were the same mind. And then once they got out there, they realized it wasn't going to happen. But the SRIA is still out there. SRICF is still out there, and going strong in most places.
But, and so is the OTO for that matter.
Yeah.
OTO, yeah.
With our beloved Aleister Crowley.
Well, I'll tell you, you hit on it, Chris, and actually both of you did, I should say. We end up in a situation where a lot of the people that started these rites that Harrison talks about, they were big personalities, and it just goes to it stands to reason that you can only have so many big personalities in a room. Someone's going to get mad. Someone's going to break off. They're going to make a competing organization. Yeah. And I think that's what we see some of.
See a statement like they got to the end of Freemasonry. They got to, and Freemasonry didn't hold anything for them after that. You know what? A lot of guys just don't have it in them to dig into what's there. And they put it aside, and they're looking for something new, something more dramatic, something more spectacular, and all that, instead of actually going in and learning. And I'd venture to say that some of these guys didn't have a complete playbook of what masonry was out there to teach them, and they just broke off and decided to do something else. And that may be a simplistic view of it, but to me, when I see them breaking off and trying all this thing and making these grandstanded assertions that they talk to these spirits and all this stuff, and none of it can be proven, and none of it, and little by little people just start going away like, woo, we got to get out of here, and the thing dies. It's disappointing because ultimately there were guys that broke off that were legitimately trying to seek higher consciousness and more truth and more learning, and I think a lot of them were disappointed.
Well, I mean, if all your lodge does is open and pay bills and go home, I can understand them running off.
Well,
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
But even if you're not getting light like you're supposed to get in lodge, there's still are avenues for self-study that a lot of us take advantage of. And sure, it's easier now because we have the internet and Amazon. Yeah, those guys had to actually go to a library or learn how to read Latin or whatever.
Learn how to read Latin.
And it's true. A lot of these personalities that we're talking about here, and I know we got to go into another chapter, but a lot of these personalities that we talking about, they're not prone to going out on their own by themselves. They have to have a following. They have to have support. They have to have yes men, I guess is what you call it. And when they don't have that, I mean, I know, from what I know about you, Kohanke, and you, Right Worshipful Sir, being alone and silent and doing our studies and trying to gain further truth and everything is a blessing in a lot of ways. We don't need to. I don't think any of us are prone to having to have an entourage everywhere we go. Maybe Kohanke, but not you and me.
You're such I wish David would have taken it one century further and talked a little bit about, the groups that were born subsequent to the Golden Dawn breaking up, like Dion Fortune's group, Society for the Inner Light. That's still around. It's 110 years old. Builders Are the Arcanum, Westcott's group, is still around, 110 years old. So Yeah, some of these things that were born again during the occult revival that only lasted for a few years, because these people had falling outs with each other, when they went off and set up their own stuff, those things are still around.
Yeah, some of them had some real staying power, and that's what's all I, on a personal level, I always thought that was really interesting about Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is when it came crashing down and these people all went their different ways. Like you had some real organizations that came out of that that had staying power.
I guess they're not in the book because they're not related to Freemasonry.
Well, and they're not lost. They're not lost.
Yeah, they're not lost. For
Yeah,
sure.
that's true. Yeah.
And he makes mention in there that there are groups out there that don't in part of the book because they aren't lost.
So these next couple of chapters, some of it I got kind of lost on because it is very specifically part of British Freemasonry.
Right.
And so when he starts talking about the difference between, for instance, the old Lancashire rituals, and a lot of this stuff that he's quoting, and even the later chapters when he's talking about lost symbols, he's talking about symbols that in the United States are not lost. Some of those symbols, like the beehive, later on in the later chapter, is something that we still actively use on the master's carpet in the United States. But apparently over there, it's a lost symbol. But let's talk about the Lancashire rituals.
That was that. I thought that was really interesting because that was, kind of it says that it was a curious form of catechism that had been used by craft lodge before the Union of 1813. So we're talking about this was after the Premier Grand Lodge split. So Yarker subsequently copied the strange lectures in a notebook, later adding a number of old disused Knight Templar grades. Yarker called them the old Lancashire rituals. 4 known surviving copies. He talks about who they were giving them to and where they kind of went. But what's so interesting about them is these are rituals that went to these lodges, and they've got craft lectures, and then you keep going. Kind of talks about that, and it has some scans of them, and then he has some of the catechisms in here. And it had the archaic wording on them, but and it says there are, but they had some stuff in common with illustrations of Masonry. And what was also interesting is they had there were some blatant Christian references that with the Union they kind of obliterated.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about the split of the Grand Lodge of England into the ancients and the moderns, and their ultimate decision to merge back together. So during the period of that split, which was how long?
Is it almost 100 years?
Yeah, it's a lot longer than people think.
Yeah, it's a long time. That's why we have ancient free and accepted in the U.S. Just depends. Once again, we go back to who was your daddy? Who's your Masonic daddy? It's just really interesting because it talks about the lectures and the differences in the lectures, and then he compares them to the Sheffield rituals, which is another set of old rituals that were found. And and this is one of the things that we on this side of the pond we don't have a whole lot of context for, because our oldest lodges are on the Eastern Seaboard, and they're still not as old as they are over there. So, and it wasn't till the later half of the 18th century that it really started to catch on in the U.S. But we just don't have the type of antiquity over here that they have in Europe, and we don't have the same type of age on our masonry that they have in Europe. So we don't go. I don't go to Western Star number 2 and go, oh, look, here's a set of rituals from before when we had a Grand Lodge of Arkansas. Like we just don't have that here. And that's what I think makes this part of the book so interesting and valuable is, like I talked about in that short, like and we talked about at the beginning, like Freemasonry was messy. There was no one really knew what a Grand Lodge was for a while, or what that authority consisted of. And I think the ability for people to look at the differences between the Lancashire Sheffield rituals and what became the Exeter rituals, and what I think it was Morgan wrote. No, what Morgan Fair.
It was the expose, like Boaz and Jachin, and then three distinct Knox. There were two exposés written in England that were similar to the Morgan expose.
Yeah, whatever those exposés were before Carlisle, there were all of these, that kind of strangely that started making for what we now would call regular Masonry, and the appearance of what we now call regular Masonry is mostly responsible for stamping out a lot of these rites and rituals. Go on.
I thought it was interesting that even during the split, you had the ancients and the modern Grand Lodges that were essentially operating as the governing bodies, but not in a way that we understand today. Even in and amongst the subordinate lodges to each one of those Grand Lodges, there were differences in ritual from geographic area to geographic area, and that seemed to be an acceptable practice. And from what I've been able to gather from the book, kind of still is over there. It's not like in the Grand Lodge of Arkansas where we have a grand lecturer who travels around with his cadre and makes sure that everybody's performing it the same way. And in Texas, the Committee on Work that has subordinate instructors that make sure everybody's doing it exactly the same way. In England, there's like, oh, there's a group of three lodges up in the northern part of Hampshire that do it this way, but if you go down south, they do it that way, and that's okay, because that's the way they've been doing it for 350 years.
I mean, it's still that way now, because if you go to London, depending which lodge you go to, is which one of the accepted works you get. The Grand Lodge of British Columbia, they've got, I think it's 4 accepted works. In Arkansas, I mean, we didn't standardize our work. I think it was either late 60s or early 70s. And depending where you were is what it looked like. So
all variations on a theme, though. I mean,
it's all variations on a theme. Yeah. And that's what's interesting. But I mean, you could have a pretty wide swing on what's normal, what's not. And it's absolutely fascinating to me. And back on the Swedenborg, it's the regularity of Masonry is, they had essentially a Grand Lodge in England, and when they Grand Lodge England declared, I guess it was right after the reunification, they're like, you can be an English Freemason or you can be a Swedenborg Mason, but you can't be both, and that essentially killed the Swedenborg Rite in England. I guess that might have been the last place. It might have killed it everywhere, but it's so interesting because when that Grand Lodge function started coming about like we know it, like that's when it really started to hammer these rites. I mean, that's when Melusino and all these just started to fall off. Right? That's not regular. And I'm not advocating that we should have a open season, because as we are all on social media on some level, we know that there's a lot of frauds and nonsense out there. So I'm not saying we should operate with no guardrails, but it's certainly important to realize that you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater either.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about this rebellion that happened in Lancashire from 1823 to 1913 before we got on air. It says, as a result of this, a regulation change allowed each lodge to regulate their own proceedings, giving each lodge an element of freedom, that the members present in any lodge have an undoubted right to regulate their own proceedings, provided they are consistent with the general laws and regulations of the craft. Today, there are around 50 different established craft rituals or workings throughout England and Wales. Can you imagine, Chris, in Texas, the Grand Lodge of Texas allowing 50 different craft rituals to exist under their purview.
Well, I can't imagine it happening, but I can tell you that when I read that chapter and it talked about all of those different variations to the ritual, it really gave me some thoughts that I thought, wow, this is why, other than excellence in the ritual and the way the ritual is performed and all of that, there's no reason for one lodge, is gonna be more acceptable or preferable than another lodge in going and being part of their ritualistic team. But in England, and with those variations, wow, can you imagine? Hey, you know, they do this over here. As long as everybody ends up coming back around to the general principles and ground rules of masonry, then everything else is okay. And I think you got guys that are what we call above ground masons that are literal masons on everything, and then you've got guys that are a little deeper thinkers. God, how much neater would the ritual be in a lodge like that? And especially if it didn't vary from what it was supposed to be, everything came back around to the original meaning of masonry. God, I think it'd be cool.
Well, it sure would make traveling interesting. Let's get
And
into these lost symbols, man.
we might have a chamber of reflection too.
Oh, watch out.
We're going to be putting Jason's editing abilities to the task here pretty quick.
I think Jason went to bed about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, probably. So lost archaic symbols, and this is the last chapter of the book.
By the way, y'all know, there was the Kadosh part and the Baldwin Rite part, and it had like the 9, and that made me think of Elu's Elu of the 9.
Yeah.
I was like, no coincidence there at all, I'm sure. Anyway, so I'm sorry, go on.
He talks first about the lost goddess and the third pillar. Carter has put forward that a third pillar in the lodge room is now missing, that which should be related to the worshipful master, and that this particular pillar represented a goddess which symbolized truth, liberty, and stability. Indeed, in the 18th century expose, Jachin and Boaz, the master asks, "What supports your lodge?" And the answer is given as the 3 great pillars, the pillars being named wisdom, strength, and beauty, the pillar of wisdom representing the master in the east. That's still part of our ritual. So it's a lost symbol over there.
But yeah, Brad, those are our pillars.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. That was very surprising to me that was in there.
I'm going to quote Pike here because Harrison puts it in his book from the 24th degree.
Mm-hmm.
Blue masonry, ignorant of its import, still retains among its emblems one of a woman weeping over a broken column, holding in her hand a branch of acacia, myrtle, or tamarisk, while time, we are told, stands behind her combing out the ringlets of her hair. We need not repeat the vapid and trivial explanation there given of this representation of Isis weeping at Byblos over the column torn from the palace of the king that contained the body of Osiris, while Horus, the god of time, pours ambrosia on her hair. The symbolism in the master's degree meant something completely different to Albert Pike than what it does in the explanation given to Blue Lodge Mason.
He talks about the goddess, all right? Kohanke, you know where I'm about to go with this. So he talks about the goddess of truth, liberty, and stability, enigmatically appeared in French and U.S. Masonic prints during the 19th century, and can especially be seen with the Masonic dedication of the pedestal of Statue of Liberty, so on and so forth. Grieving, and then he starts talking about the grieving widow. Oh, all right, outstanding, thank you. And then you kind of go back. He talks a couple pages later. He talks about this way the truth is accessed and is symbolized by the goddess of truth. The candidate understands his reasons for joining the order, examine them thoroughly, as we've seen Cagliostro as Egyptian Rite. Women could also join, and a co-Masonic spirit was promoted, but a somewhat abstract blend of ancient female deities merged to create a unique Masonic goddess. This strong feminine imagery can also be seen with the broken column, a symbol found in meme side prints, 19th century, so on and so forth, as well as the apprentice degree in the rite of strict observance. So what's interesting is we have all this where it's talking about all this goddess stuff, and to my knowledge, and you know, and I've been outside the Orient of Arkansas a couple times on Scottish Rite reunion trips, but have not been to all the valleys for sure, and certainly haven't even been to all the Orients. But as far as I've ever heard, there's one place where they practice this thing called the Goddess of Liberty, and that's in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it's part of the Little Rock, Arkansas, or Arkansas work, where there's a goddess scene at the end, and one of our members brings out or puts forward a family member of theirs, and she functions as the Goddess of Liberty. But in reading this, really made me think about who put that together.
Yeah.
Because like that's other than in the overarching patriotic style of some of the Scottish Rite work, that's not anywhere, but that's there. It's there. And then you've got all this about the goddess of liberty, stability, and
Truth.
Truth.
Yeah.
I'm about to say truthfulness, truth.
I got to tell you, when I read that section, it was an aha moment for me, because I have been to a number of our reunions here in Little Rock now, and we always end it with the Goddess of Liberty vignette, and I never understood why, other than, well, it's kind of a patriotic way to end the day. But then when I read that and saw that picture, I was like, holy crap, that's where that came from.
Yeah, I mean,
Why is it that we're the only ones that do it, other than the fact that we are Albert Pike's home? But is there anything else that does?
I mean, you've got the red, white, and blue and everything.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And so it does, but it does harken back to exactly what you said is Freemasonry unaware of its import. And that's a piece of work that we have here that to some level it's lost. We're going through the motions, but everybody's like, this is just what we do here.
Yeah.
But they never said, hey, this is something that actually matters. And it's from, 150 years ago. And this is what it means, because I truly believe for the most part, it's been lost.
Yeah. I don't think we could probably go to every member in Little Rock, and there might be a handful of guys that understand its origin. James and Larry Barry are probably among the few that understand where it originated.
That's sad when they do it and they don't know why.
Yeah.
We do it, but we don't know why.
Well, some of the other symbols, like the hourglass with the wing, Tempest Fugit, time flies, that was interesting. The silver Mercury with his caduceus, that was interesting. But then it talks about the beehive, the anchor, and the ark.
The anchor is one we have truly lost, I feel like, here too.
We haven't lost it in Texas.
Really?
Matter of fact, there's a lodge in Lavernia that has the symbols from the Master's Carpet painted as murals on the wall around the lodge room. And they have what they call the walking lecture, and they'll go up and point to the mural and say, this is what this means. And the ark is up there, the anchor is up there, the beehive is up there. And it's in our monitor.
I don't see anything about it. Chris, does your lodge have anything? Do they do anything like that?
No, not at all. In fact, this particular lodge that Brad is talking about, they had to really do some politicking for years to be allowed to do that walking lecture. I mean, all the symbols and everything are in our monitor, but to actually do, and then there's the long form of each lecture, and that's part of the long form of that lecture. But they would, the Grand Lodge would not let them perform it with the candidate going around the lodge and pointing at the murals on the wall. And they finally allowed them to do it. And it's a pretty special
Wow.
And I'm
ceremony.
glad that they did, because most people don't know that in Texas there are long form lectures. And so in Arkansas, the word lecture has a completely different connotation. In Texas, the lecture is given by the worshipful master prior to the charge, and it it goes through all the symbols of the master's carpet. Now, the short form lecture only does 4 or 5 of the symbols. The long form does all of them.
Right.
And the lecture, I've never heard something similar in Arkansas, where they go through all the symbols on the master's carpet. They go through some of them, but not all.
There's a long form. It's just Sean Castro's the only one that does it.
Well, that's kind of like in Texas, the only one that I know that does it is Ron Havens.
There's several people that do it, and I've heard it by several different people. But it's, in the interest of time and everything else, they stop and say, all the rest of the symbols are on the master's carpet, are carefully enumerated in the monitor, and blah 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 blah, and they just go right on to
Right.
the end.
That's what we do.
Yeah, and it's nice it's long, but it's nice to hear that long form lecture. It really is.
So I need y'all to weigh in here. Talk about the Ark. Is this where we talk about the original patron of Freemasonry being Noah? Is this where we bring this up? This where we get controversial?
It's where it seems like that's what's happening. What needs
I
to
would say
happen?
so.
Yeah,
Well,
but that's not how it's explained in the long form lecture.
is it not?
No, the ark is a symbol of faith and
Sanctuary. Same thing as it's got in the book.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then moving along then, because we won't
Nobody wants
be controversial.
to go back and talk about Noah, apparently, except for people like us that are actually researching true masonry and where it came from and all of that stuff.
You're
That
about to
that
go
brings us to
controversial.
the end, right?
Do what?
That brings us to the end of the book.
There's one more symbol. There's one more symbol that you're skipping.
Oh, the Ouroboros?
Yeah.
My favorite too. I can't believe I skipped it.
I tell you what. So I'll tell you, this is kind of a funny thing. The Ouroboros came into my consciousness through reading a book series called The Wheel of Time, and it was a ring that, and it's funny because Robert Jordan was known for incorporating pieces of history and different religions and such. But a group of the characters in the book, they all wore what I later found out to be an Ouroboros ring, a dragon eating its or snake eating its own tail.
The Aes Sedai. I read.
Mhm. Oh, that's right. I forgot you read that. I forgot about that. So I thought him entering or him throwing it in there was a really nice piece, and that's a piece that's kind of lost to us today. I feel like, at least in Arkansas, it is. Um, I've never seen it on any of our old tracing boards. I've never seen it anywhere. And I think if I did, people would be like, "Oh, that's Egyptian nonsense," But that's a really interesting piece, and and he mentions here the Master Mason rising from the figurative grave in the third degree. The symbol of infinity appears within English Freemasonry as early as the 18th century, appearing, for example, in a print of Masonic symbols in 1769 edition of the Book of Constitutions. So, I mean, and he also says a piece of used in Christian art for centuries. And then they have John Yarker's the Neph, where it's the Ouroboros with the equilateral triangle with the sun in the middle, which is a really, really interesting depiction. And
I've
then you
got
see
my own interpretation of the Ouroboros as a symbol of infinity, and it ties back to the Jordan books, The Wheel of Time. So it's the serpent eating its own tail, representing just never-ending circle of time, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the only other circle that I can think of that represents a never-ending circle of time is the zodiac, because
Ah,
it goes through this 25,000 year cycle and
mm-hmm.
then starts over again. So I think the Ouroboros is representative of the zodiac, the wheel of time, the only wheel of time that I'm aware of.
But I
So
like how
this was a really good book. I
Oh,
liked it. I appreciate you bringing it to our attention. Um, Chris and I have a rating scale.
uh-oh.
1 to 10 white balls, 10 being the best and 1 being the worst. So how many white balls are you going to give this book?
I have to tell you that the thing about I enjoyed this book very much. It made me mad. It made me happy. It did a lot of things to my attitude, but ultimately it tied a lot of loose ends together. Gave me some different perspectives on a few things that I thought I knew something about that I didn't, and I think it's a good book. It's not an easy book to read. It's an easy book to read, but it's not an easy book to read in the manner of trying to to get out of it what you want to get out of. I mean, what's there, what the
Yeah.
author wants you to get out of. But anyway, I enjoyed it overall. I'm glad I got it. It's going to be right up here on my bookshelf, and it ought to be on everybody's bookshelf. And I'm not going to go to the decimal point rating system like you do, but I'm going to give this book a solid 7 white balls.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give it an 8.2 because I
Very good.
really liked it. And I think it ought to be on every Mason's bookshelf. And I really appreciate Lucas bringing it to our attention because um, this is more of a history book. And you and I kind of gravitate toward the more mystical stuff, but this kind of tied it all together and explained the interrelation of some of these other guys that we read. So
Yeah,
I liked
yeah.
it a lot. What about you,
This
Luke?
I as a historian, like I thought it was fantastic. It really gave me some insight into what we see nowadays as modern Freemasonry. Um, and I definitely it's a different kind of read than something like observing the craft or something like that. It's definitely a different type of read, and I can understand if someone who's more into the mystical side of things might get a little bored with it. So I can understand all those things. That said, there's a there's a lot of mystical rabbit holes for a guy to travel down in here. I mean, you're like, okay, I didn't even know that existed. I can go. So I feel like it's a good roadmap book. So I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to give it. I'll give it. I'm going to give it a. I'll give it an 8.5 because I'm such a history nerd in the first place.
Well,
Well,
there you go.
I think this book seriously is going to, if you were to read this book and then go out and we touched on it earlier, go out and read about these individual men that started a lot of these rites. If you went out and read after you read this book and you read individually about those guys, it's going to tie a lot of stuff in together. It's going to give you an understanding that you wouldn't have gotten had you read the individual books before. And that's one of the big things that I got out of it and appreciated about it. And I know that as I go on, I'll be reading about something, and I'm going to have to come back to this book to re-verify, what I thought I got out of it before. So yeah, it's definitely worth the read. Definitely worth the read.
Reference book. That's what I'd call it. It's a good reference
Great.
book, nothing else.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Lucas, thanks for joining us tonight,
Thank you
and
for having me.
offering your expertise and historical knowledge. Um, This has been another episode of the Masonic Shelf. We'd like to thank our producer, Jason Reichenberg. He's the one that does all the real work behind the scenes. All we do is get on here and talk, and then he edits it and makes it look like we actually know what we're talking about, which is
And and we didn't
A
stop
lot
talking.
of work. So that's going to wrap it up for this show. Be on the lookout for our next Masonic Shelf short, and then we'll be back again next month. I think it's just going to be me and you, Chris. So we got
Yes.
to decide on a book. But thanks for watching, and keep reading, brethren.